Section 6. Qualia's function is a conceptual, not an empirical problem. For example, the psychologist Julian Jaynes identifies many functional areas in which he claims consciousness is simply epiphenomenal, i.e. contributes nothing to actually carrying out the function. Jaynes goes through a long list of psychological functions and then, despite popular misconceptions, dismisses the idea that consciousness plays any effective role in them. He starts with memory and reflection and questions how much detail we are actually conscious of in everyday life, and concludes that, quote, "What you can consciously recall is a thimbleful of the huge oceans of your actual knowledge," end quote. He goes on to rule out the role of consciousness in many other areas, such as concept formation, learning, thinking, speaking, reasoning, and even creativity. He says, for example, that, quote, "When we speak, we are not really conscious either of the search for words or of putting the words together into phrases or of putting the phrases into sentences," end quote. Speech, in other words, is produced by automatic processes without any input from consciousness whatsoever. And in general, Jaynes says, quote, "Our minds work much faster than consciousness can keep up with. We commonly make general assertions based on our past experiences in an automatic way," and asks how often we reach sound conclusions and are quite unable to justify them. These are clearly the result of automatic inferences by our nervous systems, in which consciousness is not only unnecessary, but would probably hinder the process," end quote. Gray uses color perception to argue against the epiphenomenalist position, quote, "Trichromatic color vision evolved in the mammalian line at the primate level. Its evolution in primates depended upon the addition to the retina of new types of cell, sorting light according to wavelength in the red-green part of the spectrum, and new modules to the visual system specialized for color vision. These developments provided monkeys with the ability to respond differentially to different colored surfaces, e.g. to pick out ripe red fruit from a background of green foliage, and so improve their diet. These developments are all explicable, and perhaps even fully explicable, within our standard understanding of biology, physiology, and behavior. There is no need to add into this explanation any mention of qualia. Yet, given the close evolutionary relationship between the human and other primate species, it is likely that the development of color vision in monkeys was accompanied by the development of the same qualia of red, green, orange, yellow, etc., by which it is accompanied in us. What additional survival value did these qualia bring to the party? If they brought none, as Harnad argues, are they epiphenomena? End quote. But, Gray continues, finding a function for qualia is not just an empirical problem. it's also a conceptual one. This is because in modern scientific culture, the dualist notion that consciousness occupies a separate psychic realm has virtually disappeared. It's now taken for granted that conscious experiences result from brain activity. Quote, so whenever a function is discovered or proposed for consciousness, the assumption is that there are brain processes that cause the accompanying conscious experiences. They are caused by other processes in the brain and by related input received via the sense organs from the environment. And they lead to further brain processes, and by way of output to muscles and glands, to behavior. There seems to be nowhere in this chain that might allow for an extra contribution from conscious experience. And if there were a gap in the chain, no one has proposed a way in which conscious experience could contribute to its filling in a manner compatible with the way in which the rest of the chain operates. So this is not merely an empirical difficulty, it is also a conceptual one." End quote. This, I believe, is Gray's conceptual challenge to explain consciousness as arising from brain processes. Since we don't even have a consensual, instrumentalizable definition of consciousness, there's nowhere within the framework of existing neuroscience and psychological concepts to even begin. This is what Gray means by a conceptual rather than an empirical problem. Without fundamental advance in our conceptualization of consciousness, no amount of empirical data can begin to explain it. Gray goes on to explain the scientific and philosophical background which has led us to this conclusion. Quote, "There's no room in the standard scientific worldview for a class of entities that stands aside from full causal interaction with other classes, and in particular, no other significant biological phenomenon stands aside from the framework of natural selection. If we require that conscious experiences should fully participate in causal interactions with other biological phenomena, and in particular with brain processes and behavior, we have to abandon the assumption that brain function and behavior will yield to a full explanation within the framework of existing neuroscientific and psychological concepts." End quote. I believe what Gray is saying here amounts to the following. If you believe that qualia have a function, then there are only two conceptual choices. A return to dualism, which most modern people will find scientifically unacceptable. B, a paradigm shift in our conceptions of brain function in relation to qualia. Both brain energy flows, referred to above, and quantum approaches to consciousness might represent this paradigm shift.